How's everyone doing tonight? Welcome to my channel. This is an educational channel, and we focus on impactful theories, discoveries, magnum opuses, tour de forces, and earth-shattering discoveries, usually from obscure sources that you probably haven't heard of before. But if you did, they would make a big impact on your life. So this is number 251 on the Bible decodes. We've been looking at the New Testament in light of the Roman origins hypothesis, which has been expounded on by numerous scholars over the last 150 years, and many literary giants before that. And the theory basically goes that the Roman Caesars of the Flavian dynasty are the true authors of the New Testament. They wrote the New Testament as a psychological operation against the Jews. The Romans had just gotten done with a 7-year-long war with the Jews from 66 until 73 AD. And the hostilities between the Romans and the Jews had gone back over 130 years before that, to when the Romans first pulled in and became the colonial power there in Judea in 63 BC. One uprising after a revolution, after a assassination, after a riot, after a war, is what they got from the Jews. The Jews were the highest maintenance group that the Romans had under their giant tent. And Vespasian and Titus, the two first Flavian Roman emperors, were generals in this war against the Jews, and they were both wounded in the war, and they both had a motivation to put an end to this crazy Jewish militancy. So when they became emperors, they embarked upon a Roman standby, the psychological operation, creating a new religion for psychological warfare. And this they had done other times in the first century, including one almost simultaneously with the Pharisaic Jews. The psyop for the Jesus Messiah was more for the more zealot Jews. And they wrote the story of the Gospels, and then they backdated the story by 40 plus years, setting it in the reign of Tiberius in the late 20s, early 30s AD. Meanwhile, they wrote a history of the war between the Romans and the Jews, called War of the Jews, under the name of Josephus, or Josephus, who wrote in 7 volumes. And if you read Josephus, you, with the with your eyes focused, you will find a ton of parallels between the New Testament and War of the Jews. There's a code that is involved, and there's a number of different themes and motifs involving the intercommunication between the two texts. You can tell that whoever Josephus was, he was the author of the New Testament as well. Whether that he's one person or a team of people, which is what I would say, or maybe even a family of people, the Piso family. Peso, maybe, is how you pronounce it. Piso or Peso, P-I-S-O. And it depends on kind of which scholar you're looking at. Abelard Reuchlin really thinks it's the Piso family, as well as Roman Piso, a distant descendant. And other people like Joseph Atwill and James Valiant would more say that it was Vespasian and Titus. Piso was just a close family member of theirs and a member of the court there at Rome. According to Josephus's autobiography, he was also a member of the court at Rome and a member of the Flavian dynasty. He's known as Flavius Josephus, adopted by Vespasian after he predicted that Vespasian would become emperor, which happened after he defected to the Romans once he surrendered to Vespasian. Josephus was originally a Jewish military commander, according to its autobiography, which is very difficult to believe. And, this does demonstrate the wrecking ball effect that the Roman origins hypothesis has, because not only does it take out Christianity in terms of Jesus, it takes out that the whole story of Jesus was a complete psychological operation and it was fiction, never happened. But it also then takes out a lot of other stuff, including Satan. Satan is a concept that is also only from the New Testament. The Old Testament uses Satan just a handful of times, and every time it's referring to a human. So the real, supernatural Satan is a product of the Romans. And then Josephus, who is one of the greatest historians ever, according to many, because all ancient historians have to rely on Josephus because he's the only voice for a great amount of the stretch of the first century in terms of history. But if we recognize that Josephus is part of this psychological operation, then can we really use him or not? Was he telling the truth about the history, but he just put this other stuff there in code? Or is the whole thing fiction? I'm inclined to think that, probably the skeleton of the events is probably true, but the details are all fudged in order to, say the right words or use the right name or express the right concept to parallel what's in the Gospels, or vice versa. That's the thing. You can tell it's a mutual, authorship. The same people wrote both of them because one side parodies the other, and then the other parodies it back. It's not just a one-way street. It's a mutuality. Michael Menescot's in his new book called Christianity's Origin as a Flavian Secrecy Cult found over 250 parallels just in the book of Luke. And he charted them on a graph and formed 5 almost perfect letters in Latin, the emerging language of the Roman Caesars. They also use Greek, which is the language of the Gospels and Josephus. Not so much in Judea, who had been Aramaic speakers, and very few of them were literate, but those that did were writing in Aramaic. Now, there was Greek there, but it was really only the elite in Judea that possessed any Greek. Also, Joseph Atwill. So, that basically means that the Romans literally signed their names to the book of Luke. APTVS. Titus and Vespasian, at least. And maybe Arius Piso. Then Joseph Atwill also noticed that in over 40 separate events, the ministry of Jesus is a replica of the military campaign of Titus. Every place that Titus goes, Jesus also goes in the same order, and they encounter parallel events at each location, spaced out by exactly 40 years. So there's a ton of evidence that is directly from the scriptures, or, half of it anyway is from the scriptures. And I believe it shows conclusively that they were written by the same authors. We know that Josephus is a Roman, a Caesar, a Flavian. So just do the math. Now, we're looking at a book here. We're in the conclusion called Operation Messiah by Rosemary Sheldon and Thies Voskuilen. And they go further into the New Testament, into the Pauline epistles, and they suggest not really knowing about the Roman origins hypothesis at the time, and being a little bit narrow in their focus, and just focusing on Paul instead of on Paul and Jesus at the same time. Because both of them, that was the motive for the Romans. They wanted to mellow out the Jews, to make them less militant, to tame them or to domesticate them. And they did so recognizing that the Jews were waiting for a Messiah. And instead, the Romans proposed a Jewish Messiah who was a Prince of Peace and believed in rendering unto Caesar what is Caesar's, while at the same time attacking many of the Jewish institutions and traditions. So this pro-Roman, or at least deferential to the Romans, and anti-Jewish character of Jesus is even more pronounced in Paul and Pauline epistles. And so they focus on Paul. They hypothesize that Paul was an intelligence agent of the Romans, and that his conversion on the road to Damascus was fake in order to infiltrate the emerging Nazarene movements, especially that of James, the brother of Jesus, and Peter. So now they're analyzing a long passage from Romans 13, 1 through 7, where Paul talks about how the emperors are representatives of God, and you need to be totally obeisant to them, and they are appointed by God, basically. So we'll take over right here. Paul's argument in Romans is different from that made by contemporary Jewish propaganda against foreign occupation. There we see the explicit or implicit judgment of foreign governments, even if God was using them to accomplish his ultimate goals. Paul, on the contrary, assures his readers that rulers are not a terror to good conduct. So the one who does good will have nothing to fear. To such benign authorities one must give honor, and the consent of conscience are three things he says in that passage. These warnings are severe and totally different from what Jewish sources tell us. The Jewish scriptures do not urge fear toward human authorities. This is usually reserved for God alone. What is missing is the characteristic criticism of foreign powers in the present evil age. In Paul's time, the propaganda of imperial peace reached its zenith with Nero's accession. Paul's lifespan coincides exactly with the Roman takeover of Judea and the declining relations between the Romans and the Jews that culminated in the Great Jewish War of 66 CE. Well, it doesn't seem to correspond exactly, but kind of. Rome's attempts to stamp out movements it considered dangerous also coincides exactly with Paul's career. Again, it goes later. If they're saying that Paul died in 62 AD, it definitely goes much later than that. How was Rome to decide who was the revolutionary enemy and who simply followed an innocuous religious cult? It was agreed by the pious of Israel that Rome was the archenemy of God and his people. Rome was identified with the fourth kingdom, the worst of all aggressors of the prophecy of Daniel. Only the advent of the Messiah could destroy its power. This messianic fervor inspired the fierce struggle with Rome's superior forces, and a terrible price was paid. The tragic climax was the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple in 70 CE. And this event was predicted by Jesus in the Gospels. And it's a poison pill because Jesus identifies the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple to be a sign of his second coming. The person who fulfills the prophecy, the person who destroys Jerusalem and the temple, is Titus. So that makes Titus the second coming of Jesus. If you follow the script of both the New Testament and of Josephus. So that was something that was definitely Titus was motivated to do that because at least in Josephus, it talks about how Titus could not get the Jews to worship him. The Jews would rather die first. And so this is a situation where not only do the Romans graft themselves onto the lineage of the Jewish patriarchs, but they also get the Jews to worship Titus without knowing it. Okay, so more than 1 million people perished in the siege of Jerusalem alone. While Paul was warning against opposing the governing authorities, he maintained a solid silence about how or why such opposition might arise. He makes no mention of persecution by the Romans, widespread social injustice in Judea, the suppression of nationalist revolts or crucified messiahs. In Roman churches, even the naively optimistic remarks in Romans 13 betray a sobering caution. Paul was spreading imperial propaganda that the imperial sword would not be idle. It could strike at any time those who got out of line. The entire rhetorical structure of Romans has an important function: to encourage submission to the authorities rather than desperate resistance. The war in Judea from 66 to 70 would not only show the futility of resistance, it would wipe out the spreading propaganda about messianic rebels, leaders from the province and Rome itself. Now, the war continued until 73 AD, more in the south, Masada was the final battle there in, I believe, 73 AD. The evidence for Paul's support of imperial authority comes from Judea itself. In Caesarea, a Byzantine period administrative building was excavated. A mosaic floor in room 3 of the building displays a quote from Romans 13:3. Would you not fear the authority? Do good and you will receive praise from it. By the time this floor was laid, Paul was firmly embedded in the structure of Christian imperial power. His own words had become imperial propaganda. Paul's words were used to legitimize the emperor's policies and the world order it instituted. The Christians' reward for good citizenship was the commendation of the emperor's officials. Paul was not offering the Jews liberation or independence. He was saying that all people, especially Gentiles, were the heirs to the kingdom, not just simply the people of Israel. Paul's younger contemporary, the Jewish writer Josephus, who also claimed to be a Pharisee, argued after his own defection that opposing Rome between 66 and 70 had caused devastation to the Jews. Yeah, okay. Just to point out that Ralph Ellis, another scholar that's kind of on the threshold of the Roman origins hypothesis, he believes that Paul and Josephus are the same person. He believes that the events that are portrayed in the early 30s in the New Testament are actually occurring in the mid-60s, right before the war and during the war. So he equates Josephus was born in 37 AD. So according to his autobiography anyway. So he's claiming that Paul and Josephus were the same person. It is interesting that both of them in the book of Acts, I think at the end of the book of Acts, and then in Josephus's War of the Jews, they both are on a ship that's sailing through the Mediterranean, and it wrecks. And there's a huge kind of survival float there until they see land, and they end up on Malta, the island of Malta, I believe. And so they both talk about an event that appears to be that they were on the same ship. There's some more, Ellis presents a lot more evidence than that. But I would say that the hypothesis is too narrowly focused just on Paul being Josephus, as opposed to, Josephus not being real and Paul not being real, and they all be part of this Roman psyop. They're just characters in a Roman psyop. And so, of course, they would have been on the same ship, because that's a parallel between the two texts. So, who also claimed to be a Pharisee, argued after his own defection that opposing Rome between 66 to 70 had caused devastation to the Jews. Really, his defection in his autobiography, Josephus, he says his defection was due to his epiphany that God now favors the Romans and not the Jews. So, but he was always a lukewarm, defender of the Jews, because he just recognized that the Jews had absolutely no chance of beating the Romans. And so why are we on this suicide mission here? Again, according to the text of Josephus. God, in guiding history, granted sovereignty to Rome in the current age. It was best to go along with that plan. Very few have trouble with seeing Josephus as a quisling, but no one has yet leveled that accusation at Paul, with the possible exception of Robert Eisenman, who we'll be hearing from probably after we get done with this book. Let us be the first to point a finger. Whatever Paul's view of history had been prior to his conversion on the Damascus Road, afterwards, in his apocalyptic vision in Galatians 1:15-16, Paul became convinced that God, who had previously focused world history on Israel, was now focusing on the Gentiles in the Roman Empire. Indeed, the international implementation of that fulfillment was underway in his own gospel and mission. History was no longer running through Israel, but rather through Rome and its empire. See, that's both Paul and Josephus are really like the two, along with Jesus, are the characters that shift, like, so you can really just see the psyop in action, shifting the God's focus on Israel to the Romans. That's the shift. God, before that, God was watching his chosen people. And then he changed and he got a new set of chosen people via psyop. Okay, this section is called Nazarenes. Paul and the later Pauline revisionists aimed at separating the Nazarenes from the Christians. And one of the ways they did this was to make certain the Romans knew that the Orthodox party was their enemy as much as it was Rome's. It was a case of, since your enemy is my enemy, we ought to be friends. One fact, however, that lay at the heart of the faith story of the revisionist Christians was that Jesus of Nazareth, their supposed Messiah, had been executed by the Roman governor Pontius Pilate, a man well known for his cruelty. So a shift in the way they told the story of Jesus' death became essential. This was the catalyst that enabled a revisionist history to appear in the worship pattern of emerging Christians. Increasingly, the Roman government symbolized by Pilate was portrayed by these Christians as an ally in their struggle against the rigid, defiant Orthodox Jews, made up primarily of the chief priests, the scribes, and the Sadducees. The Orthodox party, they said, was responsible for the crucifixion of Jesus. They asserted that Pilate actually tried to save Jesus. The central way in which the story of the suffering of Jesus was told began to reflect this shift. A traitor whose name was Judas was introduced into the Christian tradition. Conveniently, that name was simply the Greek spelling of Judah, the name of the Jewish nation. He became the quintessential anti-hero of all things Christian. He was the Jew who delivered Jesus to the ruling Jews of Jerusalem, the one who ran the nation before the rebellion. They claimed that the very people who had led the revolt against Rome were the same people who had crucified Jesus. The Jews who were among the followers of the way were, it was asserted, the natural allies of the Roman government against a common enemy. It was a unique shift that would echo throughout history as Jews, time after time, would be blamed for the death of Jesus. It was said by these revisionists that while Jesus suffered during the reign of Pontius Pilate, that suffering was actually at the hands of the Orthodox Jews. The Paulinists accomplished this transition by portraying Pilate as a benign Roman leader who, in the death of Jesus, was forced against his will to acquiesce to the anger of the Jewish mob. He washed his hands in public and proclaimed himself innocent of the blood of this just man, while the Jesus crowd was made to shout, "His blood be upon us and our children." The claim that Paul never departed from the national and religious communion of his people will not hold water. What makes Paul so obviously not a part of this movement is his complete divorce from anything connected with Jewish nationalism and his hostility towards those who were connected to it. Messianic agitation in Palestine might be sectarian, but it was never anti-Jewish or opposed to the people of Palestine. Paul and his gospel writer followers often were. Now, Paul and his gospel writer followers, now I'm aware that Luke is at least accused of being a follower of Paul, but I didn't know that there was more than one. I don't know why Paul would have gospel writer followers, because they came later, because I don't think that they were under the influence of Paul except for Luke, possibly Luke. I just think it's so much easier just to say that the Romans were in charge of the entire operation, not just the Paul aspect, but the Jesus aspect. He goes over all this stuff of what Paul believed and how it was separating, a separate religion from the Jewish nationalism, and that Pilate washed his hands, and the Jesus death is blamed on the Jews, and that's written into the Gospels, primarily maybe in Luke, but it's pretty clear that Jesus is doing the same operation, just a little bit more subtly. So, moving on, it may seem ironic that much of the pagan hostility